It's called The Search for Common Ground, Conversations about the Toughest Questions in K-12 Education. It's available for pre-order now. We're going to put the link in the chat. Buy it, print out the receipt, and give it as a gift this holiday season. It is better than any other gift you're going to give. Why is it so great? First off, it's because of the authors, and they're both here to speak with us today. There are two of them. They really need no introduction, but I'm going to give each of them a short introduction. So Pedro Noguera is one of the nation's foremost scholars in educational equity. He has demonstrated his wisdom in so many ways, but none more so than just having the coolest career. So he's taught at Berkeley, at Harvard, at NYU, at UCLA. Now he's an endowed chair at USC. All the while, he remains deeply connected to schools and kids, and his scholarship reflects that. Rick Hess took a different path. About 20 years ago, he decided to move away from full-time academia and head up the education program at the right-leaning American Enterprise Institute. He writes a new article roughly once a week. I was just reading and laughing at his wit and incisiveness of his latest one today. And he writes a new book just about every 6 months. I personally think he's doing some pretty important but thankless work in our field right now. Okay, now I want to introduce myself and pitch myself as the perfect moderator, even though I've already gotten the job. So I currently run GFE, a network of 300 philanthropists focused on education. Before that, I founded and ran Teach Plus, a coast-to-coast network of several thousand teachers for 10 years. So my job for the past 15 years at least has been to sit across diverse constituencies and look for through lines to common action. So I'm really deeply interested in trying to understand the people who sit at the polls, what motivates them, where you can get them to move, where they won't move, what motivates them, why they think the way they do and feel the way they do. Because to me, that's really important in figuring out how to thread needles and move policy forward. My early experiences working in policy were in a highly functional, bipartisan system that got good outcomes. So it was Massachusetts in the late 1990s. So that's my mental model. Republicans and Democrats fighting it out with the best interest of students in their minds. Like my panelists, I've been teaching the next generation about policy for a really long time, both teaching early career teachers and graduate students. And I've observed a growing inflexibility around debate. I worry very much that too many of us think there is a right answer in education policy and that we know the right answer. So I'm really excited to enter this book in the conversation. So Pedro, I'm going to turn to you first. Tell me a little bit about the book and how you all decided to write it.
Thanks, Celine. Well, I have to give all the credit to Rick. It was Rick's idea. He invited me to engage with him in an exchange over the tough issues facing education. And you know, although I had lots of other things on my plate, I immediately said yes. And the reason why is because I think that so many of the issues that we face in education are far more complex than they often are talked about and yelled about. And I saw Rick as a person who, even when I disagree with him, I find that the arguments he makes are intelligent, and I thought that an exchange of views could be helpful in illuminating some of the important issues that affect education facing our country.
Nice. Rick, you want to start with what lessons did you pull out as you were going through the book? What was the biggest aha?
Sure. I mean, I think, you mentioned, Pedro's had this terrific career. He's made one bad decision I can think of, which he agreed to become dean at USC this year. So, everybody's got a mixed bag. But, for me, part of the ahas, I think, connected to what motivated this is, I think for so many of us, we've shared similar frustrations over the last many years in which it feels increasingly difficult to actually have good faith conversations in which we're hashing out real, honest differences, in which we're talking about why do we think differently about how to best serve kids? Why do we disagree about why this idea is actually good or bad? And so we wind up with this thing where it becomes these shouting matches, like Pedro said. And a shouting match is, even if I agree with you, I can't learn anything from you. And if I disagree with you, our disagreement on this means that we're never going to talk to each other about anything else. And so for me, a big part of the motivation was it just felt like we have gotten more and more into this dead end in recent years. And, Pedro is somebody I've always admired, I've always enjoyed. We don't know each other. We've never lived in the same place. We don't know each other as well as, I'd like to know him. And I was thinking, if there was one person I'd really be interested in wrestling with this, it's Pedro. And so the big aha for me is, look, I work in DC and I work in education. And if you work in education in DC, 85, 90% of a given room is left to center. The funders are all left to center. The academics are all left to center. So I spend a lot of time talking to people who disagree with me and who see things very differently from me. And we're friendly, and I like to think I'm like, a reasonably open-minded, empathetic human being, even when I disagree. But it's striking is that we don't spend a lot of time really getting into why is it we disagree about X. There's a point at which you say, well, we see this one differently, let's move on. So let's find the places where we happen to be on the same page, or let's figure out what we can do together. And my biggest aha from this was that Pedro and I took about 6 months, and we actually went back and forth at length over any number of issues: civics education, the achievement gap, school choice, philanthropy, where he would write a letter. He'd write 600, 800 words. I would get it, letter, email. He'd send me the email. I'd read it. I'd be able to think about it. I didn't have to have an immediate response. I didn't have to figure out, okay, how are we going to cover everything we need to cover during lunch? I would sleep on it. I would write him back the next day. Pedro, and what happened was just this whole process meant that it was just such a different kind of interaction, so much more measured, so much more focused. And as a result, it felt like we were able to unearth places where we had real interesting points of agreement and where we were actually clarifying exactly why we disagreed in a way that all of those casual conversations usually don't. So for me, the biggest aha was actually how you do this matters a ton. And I don't think I had appreciated that.
I really appreciate you saying that. So, because I feel like that's just a huge point on process. So as I was reading the book, I was thinking about what's the road show? How do you do more of this with more people? Do you think it's possible to do this in a public forum where you haven't thought out your points of view in advance? And, it was a debate, but it was a slow, intentional debate versus a 1 hour, we got to get it all in debate.
Yeah, I remember, I'm old enough to remember about 15 years ago when Jon Stewart, when he was still hosting The Daily Show, went after Crossfire. He said that this has been just hugely destructive. It's taken what looks like a serious conversation, a debate, but it's turned it into entertainment. And that feels like, right, so much cable news today, whether you're a Fox person or an MSNBC or a CNN. And so I think the process matters a ton in a way that's not always been appreciated. I think it would be really hard to do in a public forum, because if, I think about what it took for us to be able to do this well, we had a background, we had a relationship, and we had trust. Pedro and I both enjoy, I think, enough credibility and enough security in our respective institutions, jobs, kind of circles, that we maybe have more room to take risks this way than a lot of people might. That we were both able to resist this tendency to get into whataboutism, where well, but Pedro, how can you criticize this when you don't criticize that? And Pedro had the same forbearance with me, and that allowed us to actually stick with an issue and not get off into craziness. So I think it'd be really hard to do in a public forum, but I think it's really possible to do in a lot of other forums. You could imagine, I think, lots of funders, lots of advocacy groups, lots of school districts, certainly lots of universities and colleges of education, making this much more a part of their DNA and how they go about their work. And I think one of the things that Pedro and I occasionally chatted about was just why it's how unusual this is and why it's weird that this felt so unusual.
Well, I agree. And it would make an incredible class, and, you two are uniquely positioned to do it well. So I felt like in some ways your differences fell into two big buckets. One was the philosophical, so kind of the basic principles of conservatism versus liberalism. And then another was implementation. So, this type of thing, maybe testing should happen, but the way that it happened, we disagree on. So talk to me about, number one, do you think that's roughly right? And then, and politics certainly are embedded in both of those. How would you advise a new superintendent who is looking out at different problems to think about problems as different in kind, not just different in substance?
So I think that's a good way to just talk about the differences. But I think, again, what made our exchange work is that neither of us were dogmatic, right? That is, we were open to actually acknowledging when we heard something that we agreed with, right? And that, I think we need to model that a lot more in this country over a lot of issues, because I think too often people are, stake their position, and then anything that seems to contradict it will be dismissed. And that, I guess, contributes to the polarization we're seeing right now on so many things. I think the other thing is that both Rick and I have worked with district leaders, with people who are decision makers, and we understand how hard it is to lead school systems. And I think when you work with people who are decision makers, then you start to understand the nuance of issues a lot more. And you're forced to recognize that ideological principles don't really help you in creating good school systems that serve a broad range of kids and constituents well. And that level of pragmatism, I think, helps in creating a context for what's hopefully a more interesting exchange of ideas. So to go back to the example you just gave of testing, yeah, we need to know how well kids are doing. Any educator understands that. Then the question is, what's the purpose of the assessment? Is it to rank kids, or is it to guide learning? And that is, I think, a really important discussion that educators especially want to have, because they do know that simply judging kids, judging teachers in schools hasn't been helpful. So, I think there are a lot of issues like that where there's room for a more nuanced discussion if we're going to actually make progress.
Anything to add, Rick?
Yeah, I think Pedro nailed it. I mean, a couple pieces what you point out. One is that, a lot of our conversation, a lot of our debates feel like they're debates that are geared to what's convenient and fun if you're like an advocate who likes to drink a lot of coffee and issue position papers. And it's much less geared to how do we actually make sure this is helpful to families and to kids and to people educating kids. So, Pedro's point on assessment. I mean, I remember during like the Common Core fights, I remember, when New York had the opt-out movement, and, there was a school reform team on which, I used to be a prominent member of the school reform team, was supposed to be for the testing. By God, we've got to stand the line. These parents don't mind taking their kid to the doctor for tests. Why don't they understand they should happily get their kid tested? And I remember at the time, I was like, look, you take your kid to the pediatrician, you wait for 25 minutes, it's a half-hour appointment, they do these tests on your kid, you hear right then and there whether your kid has any issues. If there's any issues, they tell you right then and there, here's the additional tests they need, or here's a prescription to Walgreens. Like, the whole thing is maybe 2 hours at most, and it's all about helping you take care of your kid. You know, New York, we're in the middle of the Smarter Balance. We're talking park. We're talking about 8, 10-hour assessments that they want your kid to sit and slog through these things. They want to then 3, 6 months later mail out some results, which are mostly used to like rank schools and teachers as part of some larger mission of hypothetical. There's no comparison. These have nothing to do with each other. And so like the idea that one team or the other, you should be for the testing or against it, just struck me as weird. Like, I am for educators being accountable for their work. I'm for parents knowing how their kids are doing and what they need. I'm for giving educators tools to serve kids well. And like, so I'm for assessment, which does that. And like, the problem is when we wind up debating these things the way advocates and funders and think tanks like to talk about them, it feels hugely removed from like the actual conversation you want to have about how do we help kids. So, you know, one way to talk about it is nuanced. Another way to talk about it is like, look, like the debates we get stuck in are just far removed from what actually make a difference for kids and families and educators. What was cool, I think, about what Pedro and I were able to do, partly because of the nature of the exercise, was really shift the focus from like the stylized sound bites that, you know, Pedro would, you know, give to MSNBC or I'd give to like National Review, and instead move it into a conversation about why we agree or don't agree about what we actually need to do.
So the book covers the waterfront of topics, as you said, testing and accountability, school choice, teacher pay, the role of philanthropy, kind of the COVID world. It's got a little of everything, all the important things, so that's great. There were a few times as I was reading it, I had to scroll up or down. As you mentioned, it's written as letters to one another. And sometimes I was reading and I'd be like, wait, who's saying this? So I would love for each of you to pick a specific issue and just say, you know, this was one where I actually didn't think we would have that much common ground. And we did. Like, I was surprised by what I ended up reading and how much of the space that we held was agreement.
I can think of a few issues like that. I think when we talked about social emotional learning and why it's important, but also the fact that it can't, you know, again, we don't want to test kids on how much they've learned that way. And we also don't want this to become an excuse for not teaching kids, right? So, you know, but I think similarly, when we talked about the role of philanthropy, which relates directly to you and what you do, Celine, you know, there's a lot of concerns about privatization of education. But Rick pointed out there are a lot of ways in which schools are already dependent upon the private sector and philanthropy. And we celebrate that. And we are happy to have that funding. So we need to when is the role appropriate? When does it seem to invade on the role of the public to have some say over how investments are being made and how policy decisions are being made? So I think on a number of those kinds of issues, we acknowledge because as Rick said, we had time to think, reflect on what the person actually said without just reacting immediately. I think that you will see, the readers will see movement in positions. You know, I've worked with districts. I know there are a lot of times when the private sector does things better, more efficiently than the public sector. And if districts don't rely on those, you know, for example, in certain services in HR, then a lot of times they get bogged down and can't move forward. So it's just helpful to have also, I think, a real life perspective on how these ideas play out in the world and not just in abstract academic settings.
You know, another example like that, I think, is school spending and teacher pay. You know, school spending and teacher pay, you know, Pedro's a guy of the left, I'm a guy of the right. We have, you know, at a high level, big disagreements. I don't think schools are sorely underfunded. But when we got into that, you know, and Pedro is somebody who believes that we generally need to make more investment, especially certainly for some kids in some schools. And when we got into it, I'm like, look, here's what we've seen on spending. I don't think the evidence shows that schools which serve certain demographic populations are systematically underfunded. That's just not true. Circa 2020. I think it's hard to make the case that, New York City is spending 25,000 plus per kid, that this is not enough money to, and Pedro, I think, to his credit, was like, hey, sympathetic to some of this, willing to kind of qualify, but saying, on the other hand, there's certainly some of these kids who are not being well served by what we're spending. They need additional programming. We need to think differently about how we target dollars. And honestly, you start to put it that way, I'm very open to that. Mm-hmm. That's different to me than saying schools are underfunded. It's talking about whether we're spending dollars in ways that make the difference for all of our kids. Similarly, on teacher pay, I mean, that's, teacher pay, teacher professionalism tends to be a big left-right thing. Mm-hmm. At the start of the conversation, one of the points that Pedro and I come at quite differently is whether we need to add a lot of additional professional staff, psychologists and counselors and coaches. I tend to be very skeptical. I think we've added a lot of non-instructional staff over time. They've soaked up a lot of money that could otherwise pay educators better. But as Pedro got into specific examples of what he meant, how these can be utilized, how they can make a difference for kids, I'm like, look, if we're talking about using them in those ways, and I have a confidence that that's how schools and systems are doing it, then it's a different conversation. So I think one of the problems is when we debate these things in the abstract, we can always we get a lot of confirmation bias. We get to latch onto the examples that we're most familiar with. And what was interesting and fun about it was that I think Pedro and I could push each other with different examples and analogies and instances that said, hey, okay, well, if you're talking about it that way, then maybe we're talking about it differently than I thought we were.
I appreciate that. So what I hear you saying there is, in some cases, I developed a more nuanced point of view through this back and forth.
Or, honestly, I mean, I think, Pedro and I have been doing this a long time, right? I mean, a long time. So I think at some level that nuance is there, but you don't necessarily take it out of the cabinet.
Yeah.
It's not like, I've written many times, I think what matters with school spending is at least as much what you do with it as to how much you have. Just makes sense, right? You give a kid $20, the kid loses it. It doesn't actually make a difference in the kid's life. So Pedro and I mean, we've been around the block enough times. I think it's there, but also you get used to engaging. When I'm doing these debates, when I'm on a forum, when I'm writing one side of a back and forth, I'm used to arguing with somebody who says, we need more money, schools are underfunded, here's 3 examples. And then I just say, they're not underfunded. And we get stuck. And again, what this exercise kind of gave Pedro and I think permission to do was go into the cabinet and pull out the nuance in the confidence that it wouldn't be seen as losing the argument, but that it was going to be that the other person was going to engage in a similar spirit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, what I really appreciated is it takes me back to the roots of so much of what I used to talk about with teachers at Teach Plus, which is there's not one right policy. And so, there's no debating to right to winning. So let me ask a different question. So there were a few places where you could tell that the disagreement was stronger than others. Were there parts, were there issues where you left feeling at least as uncomfortable as where you began? Which were the hardest ones to tackle?
I think there were issues, and Rick, you might have a better memory now than me. I think when we talked about the achievement gap, that might be one example where we illuminated, I think, more clearly where we disagree. I see the achievement gap largely as a reflection of inequality in society, right? And I think that that if we pretend that schools will solve it by themselves, we're not going to get very far, right? No country does it that way. That's making more progress than us. And I think that what's often behind the way the issue is framed are some assumptions about the inferiority of certain people and groups and why they don't achieve at the same levels. And what we ignore are the opportunities to learn. So I would, and I'm not going to characterize Rick's views on those topics, but I would say that on issues like this, I think sometimes what we really did was to kind of crystallize, where do we disagree? How do we see this? But I think what we still try to model was respectful disagreement. And just, not so much even agree to disagree, but agree to name it and then let's move on, and I think that's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, and partly, so yeah, I think Pedro's exactly right. Achievement gap. I keep wanting to bring it back. It's funny because partly it's about where do you put your thumb down. I don't disagree with what Pedro just said, but for me, there's elements there. I worry often in the public debate. I don't think Pedro wrote it or says it this way, but I think there's lots of people on the left who talk about it in ways that feel to me like they're saying personal responsibilities not a big part of the equation, that's blaming the victim. Talking about, when we talk about school discipline, that I acknowledged absolutely that I think, evidence shows that that common sense shows that absolutely explicit and implicit bias are part of this. That's fair. I think there's also a part of it that some kids are misbehaving more than others. And that if we don't name that and address that we're being irresponsible to them, to other kids. We're setting ourselves in a losing position to actually create schools that work. And so again, a lot of this, I don't. Pedro could speak for himself. Certainly, I think Pedro sees that as less central to the challenge than some of these systemic dynamics. And so partly we disagree about how much different things matter and how they play and how do you emphasize them. When we talked about diversity and equity, certainly when it comes, say, to anti-racism, I have huge problems with the way that it is being offered, characterized by the likes of Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo and the way it's finding its way into schools. Pedro has a different perspective on that. So we just, we saw it differently. We disagree, pretty fundamentally. When it comes to school vouchers, I think vouchers, education savings accounts, more is generally better for me. Pedro's stance on how those. So, some of these places, these are things that we kind of think of, I think, as just natural divides between the left and the right. But to Pedro's point, I also think you don't really hear these debates usually had with a lot of respect or acknowledgement that, yeah, it is complicated. And yeah, I get why Pedro disagrees. And I think, and that's important if nothing else, then it gives readers, it gives students, it gives people in this field permission to say, well, this is what I think is generally right, but I don't have to think you're a villain for disagreeing.
Mm-hmm. I want to circle back to the chapter, and you all just mentioned about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Rick, I wasn't surprised to read you saying my top priority isn't anti-racism training. Mm-hmm. Pedro, I thought it was really interesting that, and I'm sure there's a lot behind the point you made around kind of your skepticism around implicit bias training. We just did a survey at GFE of funders, and that was an issue where there was a lot of enthusiasm that it was needed for educators and philanthropists. But also, it came up as a topic where some funders said this could do harm if too many funders are involved in this topic area. So I'd love for you to say a little bit more about your thinking there.
Yeah. What I challenge districts and the people who do the work, is show me how this is going to improve outcomes for kids, right? And it's not because I don't believe that bias is real. I think there's a lot of evidence that racial bias is real and that it does, in fact, impact teaching and learning. But I think that too often the way it's done doesn't really address teaching and learning. It addresses race and stereotyping and in an abstract sense. But the concrete, okay, so then now I've gone through the training, am I going to be a better math teacher for these kids in front of me? And if it doesn't do that, then I think we're taking scarce resources and putting them into something that is not that helpful. So, what I've seen is that when bias training is kind of embedded into professional development on how to be a better teacher, that can be really valuable. So mine is not an argument against bias training, but it is against what I see happening in a lot of districts. I've seen many districts that have said, we spent millions of dollars for several years on bias training, and now we don't talk about it anymore. And then I said, but nothing changed. You say, yeah, but we don't want to talk about it because the white people are pissed off, and bias training is a dirty word. And that to me is a problem because the needs of the students are still there, the disparities are still there, and they're no closer to addressing those problems than they were before. So my message is there are no simple solutions to these complex issues. And when people present them as if there are, then I have to really speak up and about that, because I just think that, and I see that happen on both sides. I think I see people on the right who will say choice is going to solve everything. Well, all we have to do is look at the systems that have gone full-blown choice, and we still see lots of problems. So let's stop pretending that there's a panacea that will solve all the problems of education, and let's really get into what kinds of solutions are most likely to work in different schools.
Well, I appreciate that, although it's not the answer I wanted from you. Okay, so let's keep on this tack a little bit. So we used to say that education could, as a policy issue, it was an issue that defied kind of the typical Republican Democrat fault lines. And people would point to, NCLB as the baby of George W. Bush and Ted Kennedy. And you point to Obama and his support of charter schools. And that has certainly gone away over the past 4 years. So I would ask you both, number one, do you agree that education is an issue that defies typical fault lines? I know that, Pedro, you said you wish for it to be a nonpartisan issue entirely in the book. So do you agree? And then number two, do you think we're headed back that way with the Biden administration?
Yeah, I'm not sure where we're headed. I have a feeling that some of the old controversies will come up again, because I don't think that I haven't seen a state or a district that's kind of carved out what I would see as a reasonable approach to addressing the same issues that we've talked about for a long time. I see some progress here and there in certain places, but so my concern about the Biden administration is that they are very attached to the teacher unions. I don't think the teacher unions have a vision for improvement for public education. And so while I'm totally in support of supporting teachers, that there's more to education than that, right? And how do we address these these longstanding issues of underperforming schools in every community in this country where poor kids are concentrated? Schools are failing to the largest degree, with few exceptions. We don't learn from the exceptions, and we don't have a strategy for addressing this pervasive problem. And I think that's true in every state, and I don't think either Democrats or Republicans have very clear strategies about what to do.
You want to add, Rick? Sure. Yeah, and I think it's fascinating. So I think one, I think the bipartisanship of education has been oversold. Was oversold historically. Up until the 90s, even education was really a state and local level. And so, when you were doing these things in a state, transportation policy, first responders, these tend to be bipartisan. It's, you talk about how do we figure out how to do this in a way that works the legislative, blah, blah, blah. When it went national, arguably sometime in the 90s, I mean, it was bipartisan in the sense that, we had kind of this vacation from history going on. The Cold War had ended. There was room, education worked well for Democrats as a way to kind of shake off the old Mondale image. The problem with Democrats is education had seemed like it was one more way to shower money on unions. And Bill Clinton famously kind of, embraced the notion of work hard, play by the rules, and said, look, education's not about taxing and spending, it's about investing in equal opportunity. And when George Bush got Republicans back in the game, it was, hey, it's that we talk about equal opportunity and we sometimes sound insincere. So this is how we're going to show we're sincere, that we actually want to make sure every kid has a real shot at the American dream. And we're going to leave no child left behind. And so there was, for about 20 years, there was this real confluence of interest in the Democratic and Republican kind of elite coalitions of wanting to find common ground. And so one of the things that happened was, like, the bipartisan stuff tended to require, especially on the right, I would argue, leaving a lot of the things that we think are important kind of on the curb. We stopped talking about personal responsibility. We agreed not to really talk about vouchers as part of that. The conversation became around things like testing and charter schooling. And you found like centrist Democrats and like a lot of Republicans to get behind that. And that's changed. The coalitions have changed. The dynamics have changed. And frankly, I think the left, the Clinton era was a time when the Democrats were just really happy to have a Democrat back in the White House. And the early Obama years were like that. They were like, those Bushes, man, let's get. And so there was a sense that, look, we're willing to not get into the culture of stuff. We want to just settle for some more money. Well, I would argue that, about the middle of the Obama years, the left very much started to want education to be about cultural issues, about issues relating to race and gender. And that's, it's a free country. But what happened was, for those of us on the right in education, it felt like the major advocates, the major reform groups, the major funders had less and less interest in the things we thought were important and tended to be dismissive of core values. And so now education very much feels like a huge blue ball with little dots of red in a country that's actually 50-50. And so will that change in the Biden years? I doubt it. If anything, I think what you're set up for is a lot of tension between an education world, which is very much blue and very much takes its lead from like schools of education and kind of the unions, and a larger policy landscape where that might get traction in the New Yorks and Illinois and Californias, but is not going to play real well in 30 or 35 states. And given how closely divided DC is, I think we're looking at a whole lot of tension through the Biden years. It's not a knock on Biden. He certainly ran in a way that seemed like a nice respite from the craziness of President Trump. And he's said since the election, I've got to give him credit. I think he has spoken in a tone that feels inclusive and wants to bring back some degree of stability and maturity to leadership. But it's not about the president. It's about these larger dynamics.
So, Celine, can I just jump in just to model some disagreement with Rick here? Because I disagree about the big blue ball. If you go, once you travel the country, when we can travel the country again, you realize that, so for example, in Oklahoma was one of the first states to embrace early childhood education, right? I was in Tulsa. Tulsa has, not only do they have preschools in all their schools, but they have after-school programs, community schools, a lot of what we think of as liberal initiatives in Oklahoma for years, funded by oil companies, okay? I saw in Dallas, a big initiative led by a former investment banker to bring extra resources to under-resourced schools in South Dallas called, I forget what it's called now. But my point is, at the local level, and even sometimes at the state level, what I'm seeing is much more focus on getting at results and less about fighting these battles. Now, that I don't want to generalize, because in a lot of cities, LA, where I live, they're still fighting battles. They spend way too much money on school board races makes no sense to me, given that they don't, anyway, I don't want to criticize the people on the board, but I don't see where it's going. But in many parts of the country, I don't see the same kind of partisanship that Rick just described. I see people working together. I was given a tour of Tulsa, the Greenwood neighborhood, right, which was the neighborhood that was burned to the ground in the so-called race riot of 1923, the Black community, by a Republican councilman who talked about the effort to build community schools there. He took me to the memorial site for John Hope Franklin, the famous Black historian, and he said, we didn't get reparations for this community, but we are going to do things to compensate for the injustice that was done here. He's a Republican, and I don't know who he voted for. My hunch is he probably voted for Trump in the election, but he was doing good work, and I have to respect that, and I see that as a source of some hope.
You know, and on that point, in the spirit of the book, again, this is how it's useful. Pedro's pushback is actually really valuable. Like when I talk about the big blue ball, I was either thinking or talking sloppily right there. What I've really got in mind are kind of these national entities, kind of the national focus of the advocacy organizations. And again, Pedro's right that there's this sharp disconnect between like this thing that's happening out there and a lot of the decisions that are being made in a lot of these, you know, flyover states and communities. And, you know, and I don't think that changes. In fact, it might get worse under a President Biden who makes these guys feel comfortable. But Pedro's right that what I'm talking about, a big blue ball, is not reflective of your typical school board in, you know, Kansas or, you know, or Kentucky.
All right, so you both teed up a couple more questions that I'm dying to ask, and then I have additional ones, so this is killing me. All right, so I want to make sure, Rick, what was really interesting to me in this book for both of you was that you had this mature point of view, obviously born of many years in the field, that kind of incorporated both a worldview and evidence. So I want to make sure that you each have a chance to say, is there anything about your worldview, maybe the conservative or liberal worldview, that you think is fundamentally misunderstood by the other side, especially as it relates to education?
That's great. I'll go first on that one.
I'm more worried about you being misunderstood or not getting the airtime, so go ahead.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I might change my mind if I get it. I've never heard that question before. I love it. I might change my mind in the moment. I think there is this caricature that when we talk about personal responsibility and self-discipline, that it is an excuse to throw people to the wolves, that it's an excuse to apologize for inequities. And I think that just fundamentally misunderstands. Conservatism is rooted in a notion that there are just basic things about human beings that don't change over time. How do you get people to work hard? How do you get them to take care of their kids? How do you get them to do the things that they have to do to be a healthy contributor to a community? And for me, I think it's not that these are excuses. These are core values, which is I go back and I read Burke and I read Kirk and I read Oakeshott, that these are fundamental, unchanged, unyielding truths. And I think for me, I think it's misunderstood because I think the epistemology of why conservatives think this way and the readings that shape our worldview aren't part of what you read in most college classes. They're not part of, the book of the month clubs that get read by a lot of folks in this work. And so I think it is easy to think what we're saying something different than what we are.
Yeah.
Pedro?
So, one of the things I really agree with Rick is I think that, and I say this as a person who's, taught and worked at universities for most of my career, it's really important that we expose students to a lot of different ideas and thoughts and not just one line of thinking. And it does concern me that I think that the liberal bias is real at the university level. And if students are not prepared to have an intelligent discussion about charter schools or any of the other issues we've talked about, then they've not been well educated. And I fear that that kind of orthodoxy, liberal orthodoxy, is stifling discussion. I had to issue a letter to my faculty saying, look, I want to encourage you to talk about race in your classes, because I don't see how you can talk about education and not talk about race. And I want you to know in advance, you're probably going to make mistakes. You're probably going to offend people along the way. And you need to warn them in advance that making mistakes is part of learning, and that what we're not trying to do is to put people on trial because they said the wrong thing. Because I think we've gone too far with that in this country. At the same time, what I see is this country before the pandemic was headed in a direction that's totally unsustainable. You think about the environment, the economy. Most of the movies that I watch these days are all about a dystopian future, right? We need to create a better future, and education is invested in creating a better future. I think the conservative mindset that it's about rugged individualism, and I'm not sure if that's one you would embrace, Rick, is actually at odds with the future. Because if we think it's every person for themselves, and that the way we should, you think about this, in every city in this country, there are private schools for the affluent and a public system for the poor and middle class. And the affluent, and we're seeing it right now in this pandemic, can find ways to take care of themselves. Those who are dependent on the public system can't, right? And sometimes they can't even participate in learning because their kids don't even have internet access. You're not going to address that if it's every person for themselves. What we've got to do is figure out, how do we get people to see that we are interdependent, that what happens on the other side of town to those kids affects us all. And if you don't have a vision for that, this country is going to fall apart. And so that vision, I worry about where the conservative logic leads us. As I see the growing inequality, the growing racial polarization, and our inability to solve our common problems. Education should be a resource for doing that. But right now, it's fallen short.
So Pedro, that picks up on another question that I wanted to ask about. So we all work with young people coming up in the field. I had my students, this was this spring as we transitioned to COVID and remote learning for the first time, read my book about policy and advocacy, which they called the Joe Biden of books. They were, they all were Bernie supporters, and didn't even want to go so far left as the Joe Biden of books. You talk about working with your faculty to be able to broach conversations about race that can get very polarized. Rick, I sat in the most amazing class ever with you one time when you asked students to even try to articulate what would be a point of view other than a super liberal one, and they could not, to a 150 people, could not do it. So you all in this book have content knowledge that is brought to bear, but there's also a skill set. How do we build that skill set in people who are coming into the field, who are taking roles in educational leadership for the first time? Not just the knowledge, but the skills.
Dean?
I think it starts by being exposed to different perspectives, to reading broadly and widely. And then it's got to be reinforced by listening, and not simply espousing what you think, but listening to people who don't think the same ways. And if we can model that, and sometimes, when I was the professor in the room, if there was no one who could articulate the conservative view, I would do it and say, okay, well, what about this? How would you counter that argument? Because I think it's so necessary to realize that we don't all think the same way, and that diversity of thought is part of diversity. And if you can't create room for that, then we have a real problem. So I think you can develop those skills, but they have to be modeled, they have to be reinforced, and they have to be taught.
Yeah, I think, it's like anything else. Part of it is practice and iteration and feedback, but it's hard to do it entirely synthetically. Like, if I'm the only conservative in a room, I was teaching a graduate class the other month. Pedro was kind enough to drop in. The whole thing was remarkable. I mean, it's now at the point where I will have, classes. I've been teaching for, university level for 2+ decades, where there's nobody, they think President Obama was a conservative. And so, anytime I bring anything up, I'm just a racist. And so, when a class of grad students has decided that you're a racist, it is really hard to engage them in a constructive conversation about it. So you actually literally have to have some presence of people who think differently. If everybody in those seminars either thinks alike or is scared to share anything that sounds different, good luck. I don't know how you build this skill in that environment. If you have at least some of that, then it becomes, and what's interesting is it seems to me actually a lot of the efforts to combat racism, to build understanding that I find sympathetic are actually really good models. How do we actually create space to let people share what's on their minds and in their hearts without judgment? How do you hear them and listen rather than respond and engage on that? I think some of the stuff we did in this book, like some of the stuff we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, having a sustained interaction. So it's not we're going to do this for half an hour over coffee, but we're going to get to know somebody and we're going to talk to them in a sustained manner over a period of weeks or months. And we're going to talk. We're not just going to skirt from one topic to the next, because when you do, it's easy to just kind of go to flee what's uncomfortable and go to your safe space. What we want to do is stick with things that are uncomfortable, and we want to create strong norms against whataboutism. A response is not, how come you didn't say this was bad when X happened? It's, let's stay in the moment, let's listen to one another and talk about it. At some level, these skills are things that the world of education is supposed to be good at. Listening, empathy, understanding, engagement, iteration. The problem is
examining evidence.
There's a lot of talk about courageous conversations, but what's striking to me is how few of the people who write about courageous conversations or lecture about them actually seem to be interested in supporting and fostering real courageous conversations.
I think that's fair. So that brings us to our last meaty question. I think we're supposed to end at the 55. So Pedro, you've talked a few times in this conversation about learning and our lack of learning inhibiting our future progress. You did it very eloquently in the book in the section on philanthropy. So how do we solve this problem of what do we learn from reform this 0.0 to reform that 0.0, and how do we build? And I think it's not just a quantitative or even qualitative full analysis. Part of it is the bigger picture narrative of what's happening. You guys cited the Gates Measures of Effective Teaching project. There was a big RAND study, but I would like to say so much more about that than what was in the RAND study. We did learn some important things that mattered. So talk to me about how do we solve this problem of our ability to learn as a field?
I think the foundations have to be more transparent about what they learn and where, they've made these investments and not obtained the results they hoped for. Why? What went wrong? And also to ask outsiders to come in for feedback, because I think there tends to be an echo chamber in a lot of these foundations, and they only want to hear from people who agree with them. So I think the foundations have a very important role to play in this, especially the big ones. And if they could model some of this openness in discussion and looking at evidence, I think it would make a big difference, because I think that those with the resources can leverage those resources to encourage others to also look at evidence and not be afraid of acknowledging past failures.
I think I would add just two things. One is I think, the education research community has a whole bunch of problematic pathologies. They're pathological in the sense that they're not that people are doing bad things, it's that we're rewarding the wrong things. So there's a lot of emphasis on big studies where you get to publish declarative findings about impacts on reading and math scores, and this is how you get tenure at important universities and get big federal. Problem is, these things are often pretty far removed from the prosaic stuff of how do you help a principal or a superintendent make better decisions about how do they spend this dollar or use that staff. And so there's this real disconnect between what we reward people to study and the things that I think tend to make an actual difference in decision making. The second big challenge is this whole fascination that grew up in the last 20 years with data-driven decision making. And I think, the pandemic is a great illustration of this. There are times and places where the evidence and the science should rule the day. Should we distribute a vaccine? I sure as hell wanted to go successfully through a third stage, FDA trial. That's a place where science should be driving the decision. But when it comes to things like lockdowns, like masking, like, how do you approach social distancing, whether schools should close, these are questions that are much more analogous to most of what you see in education, where there's values and there's community issues and there's complexity, and you want the evidence to be an important part of it, but the evidence has to be handled gingerly, or else the evidence itself becomes a bone of contention. And I think, just like I think the research community has suffered for certain pathologies, I think the world of practice and doing this has suffered from a problematic understanding of what we can and should ask of evidence.
Well, I think that's as good a place as any to end it. I hope we can pick up this conversation again because I found it fascinating. Again, the pre-order for the book is in the chat. Thank you all for joining us, but especially thank you to Pedro and Rick. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Celine.
Thanks, Celine. I'll see you.